Hi, everybody. We're going to do a quick grammar overview. Actually, it may not be all that quick, but it will be a grammar overview, and it is based on chapters 9 through 14 in our Working with Words book. So if there are particular areas that trip you up, you'll want to dig deeper into the book. Use your reference books in this class. That will help you become a better writer. When in doubt, look it up. That's going to be kind of our mantra in this class, and that will be a frequent question that I will ask. So I'm going to zoom myself out of here and just focus on the slides themselves. So here's a sample of something that I had um, that was on a blog. So remarkable issues here. I'm very satisfied to peer your post. Thanks so much, and I'm taking a look forward to touch you. Will you kindly drop a mail, right? Now, to our native English ears, we can say that doesn't sound correct. And one of the big ones that we can dissect this and we can say, well, are we misusing nouns and verbs? That's usually a good starting point, and we're misusing peer, right? So I'm very satisfied to peer your post. We don't say that. And part of it is because peer is a noun, not a verb, right? So that's an immediate identifier that something's wrong. Now, this other stuff primarily is misused idioms, so I won't focus on those too much, but it gets you started in thinking about the problems of grammar. The other thing that I want to emphasize to you is think about writing as a process, okay? So what you're going to do for everything that you do, you want to have an idea in your head about what am I about to do? Then you actually write it and try not to suffer from writer's block, because what we do is we edit ourselves as we're writing. Just write and then edit it after you've written it. So you reshape your work. And when you're doing your editing, what you want to do is think big picture. Does this thing all hang together? Does the narrative make sense? And then you're going to do your line editing to say, I need to identify problems in grammar, spelling, and style. Okay? So take a look at this, just real quickly, right? The reason why you want to edit your work is because it's very easy for us to type, make mistakes and make a typo. I do it all the time. And also now we have the added disadvantage of autocorrect, which tries to think for us, and a lot of times autocorrect is incorrect. Auto incorrect. That's a new thing that I'm going to start calling it, right? So what we have to do then is we have to be extra careful to make sure our brains are really doing the work and we're thinking through this, right? Okay. So let's start off by saying, what are the basics, building blocks of our sentences and our grammar, right? So you probably remember these from, going back to grade school, right? So, but we forget them because they become second nature. And so what I want to do is give you a vocabulary for your grammar. So when you're talking about your writing, you can say, what is that doing in the sentence? What is that part of speech? And that way I can make some educated decisions about whether I need a comma or not, or what I should do and how to punctuate the sentence, or how to write the sentence properly. So we start with nouns. So noun is a person, place, or thing. So Jonathan Groves is a noun, professor is a noun, right? But what's the difference between those two? Jonathan Groves is a proper noun, so we will capitalize that. Whereas professor is a common noun, so you shouldn't capitalize professor. If I just say, the professor blabbed on the video, that's pretty accurate, right? You wouldn't capitalize professor because it's a common noun. So that's important for helping us make decisions. Pronouns take the place of a noun, so we need to pay close attention to that, right? So if I say Great Southern Bank, okay, that's a noun and it's a proper noun. But if I say it, right, because it's singular, I don't say they. They is a plural pronoun. It is a singular pronoun. So if I'm referring to Great Southern Bank, I will call it on second reference, okay? So that's really important. Oops. Verb is usually what happens. That's the action in the sentence. And so that's important to understand because usually the subject of the sentence is taking action through the verb. And boring writing usually is built around verbs that stick with a state of being. I am a professor. Okay. Now that's a perfectly fine sentence. You can use it, but it doesn't do anything, right? So I teach a class. Teach is an active verb, and I am doing something, and it's an active sentence. Usually, active writing and movement in your writing is a little bit more interesting to read than the passive or the state of being. Now we get into adjectives that modifies noun. The fat professor, okay, so that might be something we want to say in reference to Groves. It would be true, but I would prefer to say the fit professor, right? Okay, both of those are modifying what kind of professor that we're talking about. We have adverbs that focus, they modify a verb, or they can modify an adjective, or it can modify another adverb. Why am I focusing on adjectives and adverbs? Because that's where the flab is in your writing often. And so when you're looking to cut and make things succinct, usually the best place to start is with adjectives and adverbs. Okay? Conjunctions are our connectors, and it's important to recognize these because coordinating conjunctions and but or, those are really powerful and can connect sentences. Subordinating conjunctions are not as powerful and they are required, right? So that helps us identify whether we need a comma or not. So if I'm using a subordinating conjunction, you typically don't want to set those off with a comma, but coordinating conjunctions that you're using to connect two complete sentences, you will set off with commas. Okay, so that helps us understand those. Okay, prepositions. Prepositional phrases, often you might remember prepositions are anything you can do to a log, and they are the building blocks for phrases in your sentence. So, of, around, above, behind. So, where did the professor sit? Behind the class or in the front of the class. Those are going to be your prepositions. Interjections, those are just things at the beginning of the sentence. Oh, wow. Those are your interjections. So I'm just passing that along to you. So how can we use this to our advantage when we're looking at sentences and writing sentences? Well, let's look at this sentence, right? So Ozark Mule Days, we may say, do we need to capitalize that or not? Yes, we do, because it's a proper noun, and we recognize that that's a noun, and that's all a connected idea. Hosted at the Ozark Empire Fairgrounds between Friday, September 4th and Sunday, September 6th, is a unique event that guarantees both entertainment and competition. Okay, that's a fairly dry statement, right? It's not as active and it's not as fiery. And so what we can do is start to dissect what might be wrong with it. I would say unique. There's an adjective. Could we do away with that? Is that necessary? We also have is, which is a state of being verb, right? So it's passive. It's not very active. So as we're rewriting this, we may want to think about this. Maybe we don't even need to state this because all this is doing is restating what Ozark Mule Days is. And since we have dates, we assume it's an event. So why don't we just say Ozark Mule Days guarantees both entertainment and competition. Now, this sentence poses another problem for me in that's editorializing to some degree because it's telling us, oh, this event is awesome. And really what you want to do is use significant detail to allow people, the reader, to make their own decisions about whether it's going to be an entertaining or competitive event, right? So what I might do is to say Ozark Mule Days brings together 150 to 160 of the top mules and mule riders. And maybe later in the story, I'll explain how those people are chosen. What do I mean by top mules and mule riders? And usually maybe there's a ranking, right? So if you think about that, when we talk about great teams, we don't just talk about them being great, we talk about them being in first place, being undefeated, right? So you have metrics that you use to justify why you're using a particular adjective or ranking them in a certain way. Okay, so that's kind of how you can think about, oh, why am I learning parts of speech? Because it can help you make some decisions about how can I improve my writing. Okay, now let's continue. Oops, let's continue to build on these to some degree. Okay, so we're going to start adding to phrases and sentences, right? Because when we put words together, we start building things. So one of the things that we can build, and I'm going to skip this, one of the things that we can build are phrases, which are groups of words that lack a subject or verb, right? So we talked about prepositional phrases along the way. So along is the preposition and the way is the object of the preposition. Okay. And then we have clauses that are related words that have a subject and verb, but they can either be a clause that can stand alone. I went to the park, that can stand alone. Or if I say, because I want to, right? That's a clause. They're related words. It has a subject and verb, but it can't stand on its own. Okay. And then the sentence is a group of related words that have a subject and verb that can stand alone. Okay. So that kind of helps you decide what you're putting together. Okay, let's look at this tweet. All right, so we've got a tweet here. It's been 3 years since the government bailed out GM. Is it time they got rid of its shares? Okay, so we've got two sentences here in the tweet, and let's look at a particular one. It's been 3 years since the government bailed out GM. Okay, it's IT apostrophe S is always an issue for people, right? And the best way to remember it that I've found is that if it's possessive, it's ITS, no apostrophe. And the way I remember that is to say it's, his, hers. None of those have apostrophes. Now, so the other thing that we can use apostrophes for is for conjunctions, which means we're combining two words together, right? So what I'm going to do here, I mean, not conjunctions, contractions. Sorry. See, I misspoke. And now you caught me on video doing that. Okay, anyway, so we have it's, so it could be it is or it has. So in this case, that's a contraction for it has been 3 years since the government bailed out GM. Is it time they got rid of its shares, right? Now remember earlier I talked about pronouns. So the government is a singular institution, so it should be it in each instance. Now the problem is we've got the government and we have GM, and so our pronouns create chaos, because does the it reply mean to refer to the government or to GM? So this is something that probably needs rewriting in some form. But that aside, let's go back to this IT apostrophe S. So because that's possessive of shares, its shares, the government shares. So what I would do is ITS, right? Is it time it got rid of its shares? Okay. Now the problem with that is this it doesn't refer to anything. So that is an itty sentence. Sorry, I couldn't resist that. All right. Now let's break down our sentences. Now, the reason why this is helpful is because it can help us decide what case to use, right? So do you use he or him, right? Or I or me, right? So you can think, is it the subject or the object of the sentence? You can also apply that to phrases. So you heard me say earlier in this video about the idea of being the object of the preposition, right? So that's why when you say, so if I say, for my wife and me, I bought a present for my wife and me. I don't say for my wife and I, even though a lot of people say that. But that's incorrect grammar because it's the object, so it needs to be the objective case, and the objective pronoun is me, not I. Okay, so that's how you can start making decisions about which case should I use. Okay, So in a sentence, we have a subject who's doing the action. We have the predicate, which is usually the verb or verb phrase that's doing some action or providing state of being. And then there is the object. Usually there's a direct object. I gave flowers. Okay. So that flowers is the object. That's what I gave. I am the subject. I gave flowers to my wife. So my wife is the indirect object because what am I giving? I'm actually giving the flowers, but who did I give it to? I gave it to a person. That's the indirect object. Okay, so the direct object is actually the object of the action on the verb. Okay. Now we do have sentences that restate the subject, and that's referred to as the predicate nominative. So if you answer the phone and someone says, "Is this, may I speak to Jonathan Groves?" I should answer the phone, "This is he," not "this is him," because it's a predicate nominative which restates the subject, even though I fumbled it when I said it to you. So it should be in the subjective case because it is restating the subject. So this is he. It is I. Okay. So that's how we want to think about these things. Okay, so let's put this to use. So the way to look at this is here's a perfectly decent sentence, right? You can take issue with it later. After I finished my seminar, I went to the park to take a walk. Okay. So what kind of thing am I looking here? Where is the subject of this sentence? It is I, and it's this I, not this one. And the reason why I say that is because what is actually happening in this sentence? Is it that I finished my seminar? No, what's actually happening is I went to the park. That's where the action is. This is a descriptor. This is an introductory phrase. And what I find is that beginning writers use a lot of introductory phrases. Now, they're perfectly fine. You're perfectly welcome to use them. But a lot of times we overuse them. And what really will kill your sentence is when this thing is about 15 words long. And that's what you want to avoid. That's what makes bloated prose. So you can often tighten things down if you get to the subject a little bit more quickly. So in this case, here's my subject of the sentence. Now this is, remember I said we talked about a clause? This is what's known as a dependent clause because it cannot stand alone, right? After I finished my seminar. That doesn't really sound right. I need something else. So when you need something else, that tells you that's the dependent clause. Now this is an independent clause because if I got rid of all this, I went to the park to take a walk. That works. It stands on its own, so you can see that as an independent clause. Okay. Now I skipped over that thing about gerunds and infinitives. This is an infinitive phrase. So if you're trying to dissect what are all these elements in this sentence, what this is to take a walk, right? Because there's a verb. Take is a verb. So what am I doing? I took a walk, right? So that's something to think about. So that's your infinitive. The gerund is basically, it sounds like a verb, but it's actually a noun, and it's anything with ing. So swimming, running, those are things that tend to be gerunds if I'm not using them as a verb. So I could say swimming is a fun activity, right? So in that case, swimming is a noun. It's the subject of the sentence. So that's what's known as a gerund. Okay. Let's take a quick look through the different kinds of sentences. So we have simple sentences. That's basically one independent clause. A compound sentence, which is two or more independent clauses. A complex sentence. That was what this sentence is, right? Because it has a dependent clause and an independent clause. And then a compound complex has two independent clauses and a mix, right? Okay. So let's go a little bit further. So if I look at this, I went to the park and took a walk. Okay, that's a simple sentence because I only have one subject, but I have two verbs. So I have a compound verb, but it is still one sentence without a dependent clause. Okay, now this one, as we said, was a complex sentence. And then this one is a compound sentence, right? Because I went to the park, that can stand on its own, and my car broke down, that can stand on its own. By the way, a little aside here, there is no rule that says you can't begin a sentence with a contraction, a conjunction. God, I cannot get those straight. My age is catching up with me. Okay, so with a conjunction, you are allowed to have a conjunction and begin it. So if I wanted to do, I went to the park and my car broke down, that is perfectly acceptable. So why are we learning this? Why bother? Because that tells you when to use a comma. So when I begin with a dependent clause, you should always set that off with a comma, okay? Because that gives you a little pause. That's what a comma does. Now, if I go down here, I went to the park and my car broke down. That's a compound sentence. So after the first independent clause, you always put a comma. Easy, right? So now you have a rule that gives you some rules of why am I doing a comma. And the reason why I say this is anytime you use a comma, stop yourself and say, why am I using that comma? What is its purpose? Now, in a future video, I'm going to talk a little bit more about commas and semicolons and punctuation, but this one is just focused on grammar and some of the vocabulary of grammar. Okay? So hopefully that will help you. I'm going to leave you with one last thing. So if you look at the headline and notice any mistake here, correct. If those of you noted effects, it should be affects, right? And this is one of those confusing word pairs. And another great thing about the Working with Words book is it has an entire section on confused words. And so what you want to do is get used to just referencing this book, looking at it regularly. I would view it almost like practice. So, if you're, whenever you're sitting around, have the book there and just kind of glance through it and flip through it and try to take in some of the content, and do a little bit every day. Do like 10 minutes a day, 15 minutes a day, where you're just kind of flipping through those kinds of things. So it's almost like trivia, right? You can learn these different things. And one of the ones you definitely should know is affect and effect, even though they're both pronounced effect. And the reason why it's so problematic is both of those words can be nouns or verbs. So a good rule of thumb is to say the majority of the time, effects is going to be a noun with the E, whereas affects is most often going to be a verb. And that's what I would stick in my mind because I'm going to be, I affect you. So if I affect you, that's going to be with the A. Whereas my goofiness had an effect on the class, right? Because that's a noun, so that's going to be with the E. Again, you'll want to check in the book, and that will give you some more of those confused word pairs. So hopefully that's our little very basic primer on grammar. I'll have an upcoming video focused on punctuation to go with this, but hopefully this gets you starting to think about some of those grammar issues. Now, if some of the stuff didn't make sense, which I totally understand, you can either hit me up with questions or, like I said, look in our Working with Words book. Chapters 9 through 14 are the ones to give you some background in this area.